The boy's head snapped sideways with the force of the shove. His lunch tray clattered to the ground, apple rolling across the cafeteria floor. Laughter rippled through the crowd of students, sharp and cruel, while a taller boy loomed over him, his fists clenched and his voice dripping with venom. Pathetic. Can't even stand up straight. The girl standing a few feet away froze, her heart hammering as she watched the scene unfold. She had tried to walk past without drawing attention, but the bully's eyes caught hers. "What are you staring at, princess? Think you're better than the rest of us." His sneer deepened, his voice cutting through the murmur of the cafeteria. He stepped toward her, chest puffed, drunk on the silence of everyone else who dared not interfere. Before his hand could rise again, before the girl could shrink back, another voice cut through, not with words but with presence. A man's hand caught the bully's wrist mid-air, stopping it cold. The entire room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The soldier stood there, calm, still, unyielding. His uniform was gone, replaced by worn civilian clothes. Jeans faded at the knees, a shirt stretched tight across broad shoulders, but his bearing betrayed him. Straight spine, eyes like iron, a jaw set with the patience of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The bully's wrist trembled under the man's grip, his bravado collapsing in the quiet. The soldier released him, not with force, but with a deliberate kind of dismissal that said more than anger ever could. The boy stumbled back, red-faced, muttering something that no one cared to hear anymore. Every eye in the cafeteria was fixed on him, the single father who had come to eat lunch with his daughter. The quiet veteran who carried scars. No one could see. He pulled out a chair for the little girl with brown curls waiting timidly by the door, her smile lighting as he gave her a nod of reassurance. He said nothing to the crowd. He didn't need to. Silence was his shield, and silence was enough. He was a soldier who had buried too many friends to waste breath on bullies. A man whose nights were haunted by echoes of gunfire and the smell of dust and smoke. But here, in a school cafeteria, he found himself back in another kind of battlefield, the kind where dignity was tested not by bullets, but by cruelty. Long before that moment, his life had been one of sacrifice. Years in the desert, boots sinking into hot sand, lungs filled with grit, heart pounding as mortars whistled overhead. He remembered the weight of the rifle pressed into his shoulder, the deafening crack of shots, the sting of sweat dripping into tired eyes. He remembered the faces, brothers in arms who never made it home, their laughter cut short, their futures stolen. He carried their names like stones in his chest, heavy, unrelenting. And then he remembered coming home, not to parades or banners, but to silence. Bills stacked on the counter. A crib in the corner of the bedroom, too small, too fragile for a child who had already lost her mother. He had been 26, cradling an infant daughter with trembling hands, promising her a life he wasn't sure he could give. The battlefield had ended, but the war had not. It had simply changed shape. Now, years later, he lived in a modest apartment, worked long hours at a factory, and stretched every dollar like it was rations. His daughter was the reason he kept moving. Her laughter the only sound that silenced the storms inside his head. Every night he tucked her in, whispering prayers he wasn't sure anyone heard, promising her safety, even when he doubted his own strength. And so, when he saw the bully's hand raised against the girl that day in the cafeteria, something deep inside him moved. Not anger, he had long since buried that, but something harder, something steadier, a refusal to stand by while the strong preyed on the weak. The bully's friends shifted uncomfortably, their smirks fading, but not one of them dared step forward. The rest of the students, too, kept their heads down, their silence loud in its cowardice. The girl stood trembling, caught between fear and relief, her wide eyes fixed on the stranger who had intervened. It was then that her world and his began to shift. Because this girl was not just another student. She was the daughter of the CEO, the man who signed paychecks, who sat in an office at the top of the tallest building in the city, who rarely heard the word no. A man whose decisions shaped entire futures, though he never thought about the janitor's cleaning late at night. or the single fathers counting pennies for groceries. When she told her father what had happened, that a man had stepped between her and cruelty, without saying a word, the CEO did not dismiss it. For once, he listened. For once, he paused. And when he asked who this man was, when he sent people to learn his story, the answers he received left him silent. A soldier? A father? A man who had risked everything in service to a country that too often forgot him. A man now struggling quietly, carrying burdens invisible to the world. A man who had taught his daughter something her father never could. That true strength doesn't need to roar. Days later, when the CEO himself walked into that same cafeteria, an entourage at his back, eyes sharp searching. Whispers swept through the room. Students sat taller, teachers stood straighter. And when he stopped in front of the soldier, it was not the decorated businessman who held the power, but the quiet man who had acted without thought of recognition. For a long moment, the room waited. The CEO extended his hand, but the soldier only looked at it, unmoving, his silence speaking louder than any speech. Finally, the CEO lowered his hand, his eyes flickering with something few had ever seen in him before: humility. "I hear you stepped in for my daughter," he said at last, his voice quieter than expected. The soldier's gaze didn't waver, he simply nodded once. "You didn't know who she was," the CEO continued. Another nod. "You didn't do it for reward." Stillness. Silence. Silence. The CEO exhaled, and the weight of the moment pressed against every wall, every heart in the room. He looked around at the faces watching, then back at the man who refused to claim any glory. "The world needs more men like you," he admitted. "Men who act because it is right, not because it is seen." And from somewhere deep inside, the soldier finally spoke, not loudly but firmly, every word carrying the weight of lived truth. Respect doesn't depend on who's watching. It depends on who you are when no one is. The cafeteria fell utterly still, the words burning into memory. Students who had laughed before now lowered their eyes in shame. Teachers who had remained quiet shifted uneasily. Even the bully himself stood frozen, his earlier arrogance reduced to silence. The CEO's daughter, however, lifted her chin a little higher. Her heart swelled with a new kind of strength, not from her father's wealth or his position, but from the example set by a man who owed her nothing yet, gave her everything in that moment. In the weeks that followed, whispers of that day spread beyond the school. They reached offices, boardrooms, neighborhoods. The soldier never sought attention, never told the story himself, but it traveled nonetheless. Some stories demand to be told, not because they flatter, but because they reveal. The CEO too changed, slowly, but unmistakably. Meetings that once focused only on profits now paused to consider people. He began to see faces where he once saw numbers. He began to notice janitors and drivers, factory workers and clerks. He began to ask himself what dignity meant, not in speeches, but in action. And each time he remembered that soldier, sitting silently in a cafeteria, steady as stone. The soldier's daughter never knew the full extent of what her father's silence had done. She only knew that when she looked at him, she saw the strongest man in the world, not because of muscles, not because of medals, but because of the way he carried himself with quiet, unshakable honor. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, the soldier tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead. She smiled sleepily and whispered, "Daddy, you're my hero." He swallowed the ache in his throat, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He didn't think of the deserts or the nights of terror, or even the cafeteria where silence had spoken louder than violence. He only thought of her, and in that moment, he knew that honor wasn't in uniforms or parades. It was in showing up, in defending the voiceless, in being the shield no one expected but everyone needed. Years later, long after that day had passed into memory, people still told the story. They spoke of a single dad soldier who defended a girl from a bully, only to discover she was the CEO's daughter. But those who truly understood never told it as a tale of coincidence or reward. They told it as a reminder that silent strength, unseen sacrifices, and unshakable dignity can shift even the most powerful hearts. And somewhere in a small home with a leaky roof and second-hand furniture, the soldier continued his quiet life. He rose before dawn, worked long hours, and returned each evening to the sound of his daughter's laughter. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. His battlefield was life itself, and his victory was raising her to walk with the strength he carried in silence. Because true heroes don't demand to be seen. They simply live in a way that cannot be forgotten. And so, dear listener, if this story reached you, if it stirred something in your chest, if it reminded you of the power of silent dignity, take a moment to reflect. Think of the unseen battles fought every day, the quiet acts of courage that go unspoken. Share where you are listening from. Share what this story means to you. And if you wish to honor more of these silent heroes, stay with us. There are more stories waiting. Stories that remind us all that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in words but in silence.